The little girl's voice cut through the warm evening air like a blade through silk, soft and innocent and absolutely devastating. "She smells like Mama's garden," Clara said, looking up at Violet Hart with those enormous brown eyes that Phineas Hawkins had spent 2 years trying not to drown in when he looked at his daughter. "She smells exactly like Mama's garden." Phineas felt the words hit him somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere below the ribs, somewhere he had tried to wall off with work and whiskey and long hours in the saddle. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, a man of 34 years who had survived a war, a cattle drive through 3 territories, and the death of the woman he had loved since he was 19 years old. He had survived all of those things. He was not sure he could survive this. He looked at Violet Hart standing at his kitchen table with a smear of flour on her cheek, and his daughter's small hand wrapped around 2 of her fingers, and something in his chest cracked open like drought-parched earth receiving the first rain of spring. He did not want it to crack open. He had sealed that ground deliberately. He said nothing. He turned. He walked out the back door into the purple dusk of a Texas evening, and he stood on the back porch with his hands braced against the railing, staring out at the Hawkins ranch land spreading endlessly before him, and he breathed and breathed and breathed until he could almost pretend that his eyes were not burning. That was the moment. That was the knife point on which everything balanced. But the story did not begin there. It began 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in the town of Caldwell, Texas, in the spring of 1879, when Phineas Hawkins rode into town for the first time in 3 months and encountered something he had not planned for in any calculation he had ever made about his future. He had planned for a great many things. He had planned for drought. He had planned for cattle prices dropping and the railroad men cheating him on weight. He had planned for his ranch hands quitting, and for the wells running low, and for the roof of the main house needing replacement. He had planned, in a grim and practical way, for his own loneliness, because loneliness was something a man could outlast if he kept his hands busy enough. He had not planned for Violet Hart. Caldwell, in the spring of 1879, was a town caught between 2 eras. The cattle drives were still running through, though the old trails were being carved into sections by farmers stringing wire along their boundaries. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it had come a different kind of settler, people who arrived not to drive cattle or prospect for silver but to establish something more permanent. Shops were opening. A school had been built. There was now a proper physician and a dentist who came through every 6 weeks. The Caldwell Gazette had been printing for 18 months and considered itself a paper of record. It was into this evolving, complicated town that Violet Hart had arrived 7 weeks before Phineas encountered her, stepping off the southbound train from Kansas City with 2 leather traveling bags, a trunk full of books, and a letter of introduction from the Kansas City Ladies' Aid Society recommending her highly as a schoolteacher of excellent character and considerable learning. She was 26 years old and she had secrets. That much was obvious to anyone who bothered to look past the pleasant exterior she presented to the world. The mayor's wife, Margaret Tolliver, had told anyone who would listen that there was something guarded about the new schoolteacher, something that she held back when she smiled, something that kept her eyes from being entirely at rest. Most people in Caldwell had decided not to press on it. Violet Hart taught their children well, arrived at the schoolhouse every morning before any of the students, stayed late in the afternoons to help the ones who struggled, and on Sunday mornings sat in the 3rd pew at the Presbyterian church without causing anyone any trouble. That was enough for most of Caldwell. Phineas Hawkins, on that Tuesday morning in late April, was not in town for philosophy. He was there for grain, for a new bridle, and to send a letter to a cattle buyer in Fort Worth. He had no intention of meeting anyone new. He had no intention of anything beyond the efficient completion of his errands and a return to the ranch before dark. He rounded the corner by the mercantile and nearly knocked Violet Hart off her feet. She had been carrying a stack of books, primers, and a McGuffey reader, and what appeared to be an arithmetic text, and the collision sent them scattering across the wooden sidewalk like leaves in a storm. Phineas grabbed her elbow to keep her from going down, and for one suspended moment they were very close together, his hand on her arm, her face tilted up to his, and then she said, "I have been walking these boards for 7 weeks, and this is the first time I have fallen into anyone," with such dry composure that he almost laughed, which was something he had not done in longer than he could accurately remember. "I apologize," he said, releasing her arm and crouching to gather the books. "I was not watching my path." "Nor was I," she admitted, crouching to help him, and their hands reached for the same book at the same moment and stopped a half-inch from each other. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was a man of 34 with the sun and wind and grief written across his face in lines that made him look simultaneously older and more substantial than his years. She was a woman of 26 with dark hair pinned severely enough to suggest she was trying hard to be taken seriously, and eyes the color of the Texas sky in that particular blue hour before full dark. He picked up the book. He handed it to her. He stood. She stood. "Phineas Hawkins," he said, because some instinct he did not fully endorse made him introduce himself rather than tip his hat and walk away. "I have a ranch about 8 miles east of town." "Violet Hart," she said. "I teach at the Caldwell school." She paused. "I have heard of the Hawkins ranch. My students speak of it." "Do they?" "One of them in particular," she said, and something in her voice was careful and kind in equal measure. "A little girl named Clara." He went still in a way that was not quite stiffness and not quite warmth. It was something between the two. "Clara is my daughter," he said. "I know," Violet said. "She is remarkable. She reads at a level 2 years above her age, and she draws horses with extraordinary accuracy for a 7-year-old. She met his eyes. She also keeps a photograph on her desk at school, a woman with flowers in her hair. I assumed it must be her mother." The word landed between them with the weight of something falling from a great height. Phineas held it for a moment before he said, "Her mother passed 2 years ago." Violet Hart did not say she was sorry in that reflexive way people did, the way that felt like a closed door rather than an open hand. She said, "Clara talks about her garden." Phineas looked out at the street rather than at this woman who had just walked directly into the most private territory in his life. "Ruth grew roses," he said, and did not know why he said it, "and lavender, and a climbing vine along the south wall of the house. I have not been able to bring myself to clear it away." Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am glad you have not. There is something important about keeping growing things alive." He looked back at her. There was something in those words that was not quite about gardens, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. He tipped his hat. He picked up his remaining errands. He went back to the ranch. But he thought about her on the 8-mile ride home, and that itself was the beginning of the problem. Clara Hawkins was, as Violet had said, remarkable. She was 7 years old with her father's dark eyes and her mother's wild red-brown hair, and an opinion about nearly everything that she expressed without hesitation. She had been coping with the loss of her mother in the way children sometimes did, by holding very still in the center of her grief and watching the world with those enormous, serious eyes, cataloging everything she saw with a caretaker's precision. She noticed, for example, that her father had stopped eating regular meals. She noticed that he slept sometimes in the chair by the fire rather than in the bedroom, because the bedroom was where Mama had been, and rooms hold memory the way fabric holds perfume, long and clinging. She noticed that he laughed at nothing since Mama died, that he smiled only at her, and only the small, practiced smiles of a man keeping a promise to himself to be present for his child, even when presence cost him something. She also noticed, on the Thursday 2 weeks after Phineas met Violet Hart on the sidewalk, that her father came to pick her up from school and stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse for 35 seconds longer than necessary before he cleared his throat and said her name. Violet was at the blackboard, erasing the day's arithmetic problems. She turned at the sound of his voice and said, Mr. Hawkins, with a composure that Clara would later describe to the ranch cook, me, as very grown-up and serious, but also like she was secretly glad. Clara was not wrong. Violet had been thinking about Phineas Hawkins at intervals she found inconvenient since the collision outside the mercantile. She had been thinking about the lines in his face, and the careful way he had said Ruth grew roses, as if the words were something fragile he was setting down gently. She had been thinking about the darkness under his eyes and the straightness of his back, the posture of a man who was keeping himself upright through sheer determination. She had also been thinking about her own secrets, the ones that had followed her from Kansas City like shadows she could not outrun, and reminding herself that a woman with a dark past had no business wandering into someone else's grief. But here was Phineas Hawkins in the doorway of her schoolhouse, and here was Clara running to him with her drawings tucked under her arm, and here was the evening light making gold of everything. And Violet Hart's resolve was considerably less firm than it generally presented itself as being. "Miss Hart teaches us about stars," Clara told her father, with the unfiltered enthusiasm of a child delivering a report of great importance. "She knows all their names. Did you know that the Greeks had stories about every single one of them?" Phineas looked from his daughter to Violet. "I did not know that." "I would be happy to lend Clara a book about it," Violet said, crossing to her desk and pulling a slim illustrated volume from the pile beside her. She held it out to the girl. "The pictures are very good." Clara took it with both hands as if it were precious. Then she looked at her teacher. Then she looked at her father. Then she made the calculation that only children and card sharks can make quickly and said, "Papa, could Miss Hart come to supper sometime? Me makes very good food and we have plenty." The silence that followed was precisely the length of two adults realizing they had been outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old. Phineas said, "I am sure Miss Hart has her own arrangements." Violet said, "That is very kind of you, Clara." Clara said, "But could she?" Phineas looked at Violet with an expression that was equal parts embarrassed and underneath the embarrassment something else. Something that he did not name and she did not name, but that sat between them anyway. "If you are ever free of an evening," he said, "it is just supper." "I would like that," Violet said. "Thank you." She came the following Saturday, which Phineas had not expected quite so quickly, and which told him something about Violet Hart that she had not yet said aloud. She arrived on horseback, which also told him something, because she rode well, with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up around horses rather than learning them as an adult accomplishment. She wore a dark green dress that was practical rather than fancy, and her dark hair was pinned up but less severely than he had seen it in town. And she carried a jar of apple preserves from the mercantile, because she had been raised not to arrive at someone's table empty-handed. Me, who had been the Hawkins ranch cook for 11 years, and therefore considered herself the unelected authority on what was good for the family, took one look at Violet Hart standing in the kitchen doorway and said, "Sit down and stay a while," which was me's highest form of welcome. Supper was good and the conversation was easier than Phineas had anticipated, because Violet was skilled at drawing people out without making them feel observed, a quality she had likely developed out of professional necessity and perhaps out of something more personal. She asked me about the ranch's history. She asked Phineas about the cattle. She let Clara tell her an elaborate story about a horse named General who had escaped his paddock twice and been found both times in the kitchen garden eating me's squash. He had a preference for squash specifically. Violet asked Clara, entirely seriously. "Only the yellow ones," Clara said. "Me says he has discriminating taste." "Me is being charitable," Phineas said. And that was when Violet laughed, genuinely and fully, not the polite social laugh but the real one, and something in the room shifted. After Clara was put to bed, they sat on the front porch in the cooling evening and me had gone to her own quarters, and it was just the two of them and the sound of cicadas and the enormous Texas sky going dark above them. "How long were you married?" Violet asked, and she asked it the way someone asks a question they have earned the right to ask, directly but gently. 11 years, Phineas said. We married young. Too young, some would have said. Ruth was 18 and I was 20. But we were right about it. He paused. People can be young and right at the same time. It happens. I believe that, Violet said. He looked at her. Are you married? No, she said without elaboration. He waited the way a man waits who has learned that silence can be its own form of invitation. She said after a moment, I was engaged. 3 years ago in Kansas City. It did not happen. I am sorry, he said. Do not be, she said, and there was something very certain in it. He was not a good man. I did not know that for a long time. By the time I understood it fully, other people had been hurt by it, and I was partly responsible for not seeing it sooner. She stopped. That is probably more than you needed to know. It is exactly as much as you wanted to say, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cicadas were very loud and the stars were very bright and the evening was very warm. I think, Violet said slowly, that I came to Caldwell partly to start somewhere that did not already have a story about me in it. Everybody here has a story about themselves that they left somewhere else, Phineas said. That is largely what the West is. Is that what brought you here, leaving a story behind? No, he said. I came here because I wanted land of my own and this was where I could get it. I brought my stories with me. He looked out at the dark beyond the porch. Ruth liked it here. She said it was a place where things could grow if you gave them enough water and enough stubbornness. Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she sounds like she was wonderful. She was, Phineas said. She was straightforward and kind, and she fought for everything she believed in with both hands. She deserved more years than she got. He stopped. I am not sure why I am telling you this. Perhaps because it needs telling, Violet said. Perhaps because holding things entirely inside eventually makes them very heavy. He looked at her again. You speak like someone who knows about that. I do, she said simply. I know quite a lot about it. She rode back to town at 9 o'clock, before the dark was full and dangerous, and Phineas stood at the gate and watched her until she was out of sight, and then stood a little longer at the gate before he went back inside. Clara was not, technically, asleep. She had the window open and had heard most of the porch conversation, which she would not mention to her father because she understood, in the way that perceptive children understand, that adults needed the privacy of thinking certain things were their own discovery. But she lay in her bed in the dark and thought about how the evening had been different from all the evenings of the last 2 years, different in a way that felt like weather changing, the particular shift in air that comes before rain. She thought about how Miss Hart smelled when she had leaned over to look at Clara's drawing of General. She had not been able to name it then, but now she could. It was lavender and rose water and something green, something growing. She thought about this for a very long time, and what she thought was that it was the smell of the garden on the south side of the house, the garden that nobody tended anymore but that kept growing anyway because Ruth Hawkins had planted hardy things. She tucked this observation away. She was 7 years old and she understood that some things needed to be said and some things needed to wait for exactly the right moment. She was good at waiting. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, several things happened and all of them mattered. Violet Hart came to the ranch twice more, once for supper and once on a Wednesday afternoon when Clara's riding lesson had ended early, and Phineas had offered to show her the eastern pasture where the creek ran, because she had mentioned she had never seen a creek in that particular shade of red-brown that came from the iron-rich Texas soil. This was, if he was honest with himself, not entirely about the creek. But he was not, in those weeks, being entirely honest with himself. What he was doing was watching Violet Hart with the careful, detailed attention of a man who has been alone long enough to notice everything about the people who matter to him. He noticed that she always checked on the quietest child in any room, the one most likely to be overlooked. He noticed that she had a habit of touching the spine of a book before she opened it, as if greeting it. He noticed that she was better at listening than almost anyone he had ever met, and that this was not a passive quality in her but an active one, a choice she made, a gift she gave. He also noticed that she was carrying something difficult. It surfaced in small ways, in the tightening around her eyes when certain subjects came near, in the way she sometimes went very still in the middle of a sentence as if she was editing herself, pulling something back from the edge before it fell. He did not press on it. He had secrets of his own, not dramatic ones, but the quiet secrets of a man's interior life, the calculations about whether he was being a good enough father, the nights when he woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark, convinced that he was failing everyone who depended on him. The dramatic secrets, however, had a way of announcing themselves regardless of whether anyone was ready. It was Margaret Tolliver, the mayor's wife, who delivered the announcement. She came to Phineas one afternoon in the second week of May, arriving at his ranch in the mayor's good buggy with the expression of a woman who considers herself the bearer of important civic information. "I feel it is my duty," she said, seated in the front parlor with her back very straight and her cup of me's coffee untouched, "to inform you that certain facts about Miss Violet Hart's history have come to my attention." Phineas said nothing and waited. "The man she was engaged to in Kansas City," Margaret said, with the careful diction of someone who has rehearsed this, "was a Mr. Gerald Crane. Mr. Crane was a business partner of her father's. He was found, after the engagement was ended, to have been engaged in significant financial fraud. He swindled a number of families in Kansas City out of their savings. The inquiry damaged the reputation of Hart and Company, her father's firm." "That sounds like it was Crane's fault," Phineas said. "The question," Margaret said delicately, "is how much Miss Hart knew and when." Phineas looked at her steadily. "Is there evidence that she knew?" "There are questions," Margaret said. "Where there are questions, reputations suffer. You have a young daughter and a reputation in this community, Mr. Hawkins. I simply felt you should have the full picture." After Margaret left, Phineas sat for a long time in the parlor. He turned the information over the way you turn a rock to see what lives under it. He thought about the way Violet had said, "I did not know that for a long time." By the time I understood it fully, other people had been hurt by it, and I was partly responsible for not seeing it sooner. He thought about the dark past she had implied without naming. He thought about why she had come to a town in Texas where nobody knew her name. He thought about betrayal and how it lived in people afterward, the way it made you distrust your own judgment, the way it could make a person want to start over somewhere new with nothing that had already been decided about them. He thought about how none of what Margaret had told him changed a single thing. He knew about Violet Hart from direct observation, and that direct observation was the only currency he had ever trusted. He sent a note to her by the post the next morning, asking if she would do him the kindness of a meeting. She came to the ranch that afternoon, riding herself, and she knew before she got through the gate that something had shifted, because Phineas Hawkins wore his feelings with more transparency than he probably intended, in the set of his jaw and the way he held himself when something was weighing on him. "Margaret Tolliver came to see me yesterday," he said, when they were on the porch. Violet said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Ah, she told me about Gerald Crane." Violet set down the cup me had brought her. She pressed her hands flat on her knees, a steadying gesture. "What did she tell you specifically?" "That he was a fraudster, that the investigation damaged your family's business, that questions were raised about what you knew and when." Violet looked at him. Her face was very still, but it was not the stillness of innocence. It was the stillness of a person who has rehearsed the possibility of this moment many times and decided what she would and would not do in it. "I will tell you the truth," she said. "Gerald was my father's partner for 6 years before he and I became engaged. I thought I knew him. I did not know him at all. He had been stealing from clients' accounts for 4 of those 6 years, using my father's name and reputation to cover it. When one of the client's wives came to me privately and said she believed something was wrong, I did not take it seriously enough. I told her I would look into it, and I did not look hard enough. 3 months later it all collapsed. 12 families lost their savings. My father's firm lost everything. Gerald fled to Chicago." She paused. The courts found no evidence that I was directly involved because I was not, but I should have looked harder when I had the chance. I did not, and people were hurt. Phineas was quiet. I came here because in Kansas City I was Gerald Crane's fiancée and the daughter of the man whose business he ruined. Here I am just a schoolteacher. That is what I wanted. I did not deceive you intentionally by not telling you this. I simply wanted to find out first whether I was going to matter to you, because it is a painful story to tell to someone who is not going to matter. Phineas looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was very bright and the air smelled of the approaching summer. You should have looked harder, he said. She blinked. Yes. But you know that, he said. You have clearly been living with knowing that for 3 years. And the knowing is different from the doing. Not in any way that helped those families, she said. No, he agreed. But it matters for understanding what you are. He looked out at the pasture, then back at her. I have made my own errors. I did not look hard enough at signs that Ruth was ill until it was very late. By the time I insisted on the doctor, there was not much he could do. I have been living with that for 2 years. He paused. I do not tell you that to compare griefs. I tell you because I want you to understand that I am not sitting here as a man without his own failures. Violet looked at him. There was something in her eyes that was dangerously close to tears, and she was clearly not a woman who cried easily. I think, she said carefully, that you are a remarkable person. I think, he said equally carefully, that you matter to me. That appears to already be decided, regardless of what I planned. They looked at each other in the afternoon light, and nothing else was said, and everything was clear. What followed was a courtship of great caution and considerable feeling, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind. They did not rush it. Phineas was a man who had known one love very fully, and had learned from that experience the value of patience and the danger of taking moments for granted. Violet was a woman who had made one catastrophic error in judgment about a person's character, and was committed to not repeating it, which meant moving slowly and watching carefully, even when what she wanted was to move forward. Clara watched all of this with 7-year-old intensity and said nothing about most of it, which was a great feat of self-discipline. She had decided to like Miss Hart early on, and nothing had given her reason to revise this. She had noticed that Miss Hart asked her about Mama sometimes, not in an awkward way, but in the direct way of someone who was not frightened by the subject, which was different from how most adults treated it. She had noticed that Miss Hart sat with whatever Clara told her, and did not hurry past it. She had also noticed in June, when the roses on the south wall of the house bloomed for the second summer since Mama's death, that Miss Hart spent a long time looking at them. Not sadly, just looking, with the kind of attention you give something beautiful. There was a Sunday afternoon in early July when the 3 of them were in the garden together, Clara showing Violet the specific rose that Mama had called her best one. A deep red climbing rose that her mother had planted the first summer she and Phineas were married, and that had spread across 6 feet of the south wall in the 12 years since. Phineas stood a little back from them, watching, and something about the scene knocked the breath out of him because it was so domestic and so tender and so much like something he had been afraid he would not have again. Violet crouched beside Clara to look at the rose at Clara's level. Clara said something and Violet laughed and Clara laughed. Phineas watched his daughter laugh with a fullness he had not seen from her since before Ruth died, and the feeling in his chest was so complex he could not have named it. There was grief in it, present and real, and there was something else, something tentative and bright. That evening at supper, Clara was quiet in the way that meant she was processing something significant. After the dishes were cleared and Me had retired and Violet was preparing to make her ride back to town, Clara tugged her father's sleeve and said with a child's absolute directness, "Papa, why doesn't Miss Hart just stay?" Phineas said. "Clara." "I mean stay in Caldwell," Clara said, with such practiced innocence that both adults recognized the diplomatic retreat. "She is our friend. Friends should stay nearby." "Miss Hart lives in town," Phineas said. "That is nearby." 8 miles is not nearby," Clara said with 7-year-old precision, 8 miles is far, especially in a storm. It had not stormed that day. It was not expected to storm. Violet pressed her lips together to contain something. "Go wash your hands for bed," Phineas said. Clara went, trailing significance. Violet said with the even tone of someone maintaining composure through effort, "She is not subtle." "She gets it from her mother," Phineas said. Ruth had no patience for the long way around any point. "That sounds like an admirable quality." "It was," he said. He looked at her. "Is." "Phineas," Violet said. "I know," he said. "I know the timing is complicated. I know there are things we have not said yet. I am not asking for anything tonight." "I am not afraid of you asking," she said. "I am afraid of what I would say." "What would you say?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think I would say yes to whatever you were asking, and that frightens me considerably because I am not certain I have earned the right to it." He stepped closer. Not close enough to breach any propriety, but close enough for the distance between them to change character. "You are not Gerald Crane," he said. "You are not your own worst mistake. You are the woman who has been sitting with my daughter for 2 months and treating her like she is both remarkable and perfectly ordinary, which is exactly what she needs and exactly what is hard to do." He stopped. "I have been paying attention." "So have I," Violet said. "You are the most careful father I have ever watched. You are also running yourself into the ground trying to be everything this ranch needs and everything your daughter needs and leaving no one to take care of you." "Careful," he said quietly, "or I might believe you are suggesting something." "I am absolutely suggesting something," she said. "I just cannot decide if it is too soon." "Ask Clara," he said. "She appears to be running the timeline." She laughed that real laugh again, and the evening around them felt lit from inside. He walked her to her horse. He helped her mount, which was not something she needed, but the contact of his hand was a thing they both permitted, and she looked down at him from the saddle for a moment before she said, "Come to town next Saturday. We could walk in the evening." "We could," he said. "Will you?" "Yes," he said. "I will." She rode away. He stood at the gate until she was a moving shadow in the dark beyond his lantern's reach, and then stood a little longer. He was, he understood, in the process of falling in love. He was not falling the way he had fallen as a 20-year-old, precipitously, and with no thought of the bottom. He was falling the way a man falls who knows exactly what is at stake, who can see every risk and complication, who understands that the heart is not a thing that recovers easily from loss. He was falling carefully, deliberately, with his eyes open, which did not make it any less certain. He went back inside and sat with Clara at the kitchen table while Mee brought warm milk, and they looked at the star book Violet had lent them. And Clara showed him the constellation she had memorized that week, and he thought about how the world could be very dark and very full of light at the same time, and that this was not a contradiction. It was on the following Saturday walk that Phineas told Violet something he had not planned to tell her. They had walked the main street of Caldwell in the blue of early evening, past the Gazette office and the new dry goods store, and the wide porch of the Alvarez family's restaurant where people sat in the cool. They had turned onto the quieter street that ran behind the church, where there was a small park with benches and a cottonwood tree that was getting very old and grand, and they sat on a bench in the failing light, and Phineas looked at his hands and said, "There was a moment, about 6 months after Ruth died, when I thought seriously about selling the ranch." Violet was very still. "What stopped you?" "Clara," he said. "Clara was born on that land. Her mother is buried on that land. Selling it felt like abandoning something that she needed to grow up connected to." He paused. "And Ruth would have been furious with me." "She sounds like she would have had opinions about that," Violet said. "She had opinions about everything," he said, with a smile that was full of grief and full of love in equal measure. "She was never quiet about them." Violet was looking at the old cottonwood. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know that I am asking because I care about the answer, not because I am testing you." "Ask," he said. "Does loving someone again feel to you like a betrayal of Ruth? Not an accusation, just genuinely curious." He was quiet for a moment. "It did," he said. "For the first year I would not even let myself consider it. It felt like suggesting she was replaceable, which she is not. She will never be. He looked at Violet. But I have come to believe that people are not replaceable and love is not a finite resource. Ruth would not have wanted Clara to grow up without something warm in the house. She would not have wanted me to turn into just a man alone in a field. He stopped. She would have liked you. She was direct and she respected directness, and she was never afraid of something just because it was complicated. Violet looked at him in the fading light. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them, and she held it there. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that while the evening came down full around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the not saying was its own language. He walked her home. At the door of her boarding house, she turned and looked at him and said, "I am going to say something entirely too honest." "Please," he said. "I think I have loved you for a while already," she said. "I think it started when you told me Ruth grew roses, on the sidewalk outside the mercantile, in that voice like you were setting something precious down very gently. I think something happened to me at that moment that I have been trying to be reasonable about ever since." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I think something happened to me too." He kissed her then, because it was exactly the right moment, and she kissed him back, standing in the light from the boarding house window with the sounds of Caldwell's Saturday evening all around them. And it was not a tentative kiss or a careful kiss, but a full and genuine one, the kind that acknowledges that the feeling between two people is real and that further attempts at reasonableness would be dishonest. When they stepped apart, she was looking at him with an expression that was wholly unguarded, and he thought he had never seen anything so brave in his life as a person letting down every wall they had built. "Come to supper Sunday," he said. "Yes," she said. He walked back to where he had tied his horse with considerably more lightness than he had felt going in any direction in a very long time. The following weeks were, in the way of good things that arrive after a long absence, almost too good to fully absorb. Violet came to the ranch on Sundays. Phineas came to town on Thursdays, which was a long ride for an evening, but he did it without complaint, and me, who knew about the Thursdays, said nothing, but always made sure his morning coffee was especially strong on Fridays. Clara was told on a Sunday in August that Miss Hart was her father's special friend, which was the phrase Phineas had thought about very carefully and which Clara received with an expression of such elaborate nonchalance that both adults understood she had been expecting this for some time. "Like courting?" Clara asked. "Yes," Phineas said. "Like courting." "Good," Clara said, and went back to drawing general. Violet had been watching the exchange with her hand over her mouth, and when Clara left the kitchen she looked at Phineas with her eyes bright and said, "She is extraordinary." "She is a menace," Phineas said. "She has been running this household for years. I live here at her discretion." "She has excellent taste," Violet said, "both in horses and in people." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it in his. The dark past that Violet had brought with her to Caldwell made one more attempt to define her in September, when Gerald Crane's name appeared in the Caldwell Gazette in a brief note indicating that he had been arrested in Chicago for a new fraud scheme and was awaiting trial. Margaret Tolliver was heard to say at the ladies' reading circle that one could only hope this would draw a line under the whole unfortunate affair. Violet read the Gazette notice alone in her room at the boarding house and felt a complex knot of things untangle in her chest, not all the way, but partially. She wrote a letter that evening to one of the Kansas City families she knew had lost money in Crane's scheme, a woman named Frances who had been kind to Violet even in the aftermath when she would have been within her rights not to be. She told Frances that she was glad justice was being served, and that she thought about the harm done with regular grief, and hoped Frances and her family were finding their way forward. She folded the letter and addressed it and felt for the first time in 3 years that she was not entirely defined by what she had failed to see. She told Phineas about the Gazette notice and the letter when he came to town the following Thursday. He listened. He said, "You could have not written the letter." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." "That is who you are," he said. "Margaret Tolliver does not understand that, but I do." The question of what came next arose in October, when the air began to turn, and the evenings cooled, and the cattle drives that had wound through Caldwell all summer were finishing out their last runs. Phineas had been thinking about it for longer than he admitted. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about all important things, from many angles with care, not rushing toward the answer but letting it arrive at its own time. And the answer that kept arriving from every angle was that Violet Hart was the person he wanted to share his life with, not to replace what he had had but to build something new that honored both the past and the present. He asked her on a Saturday evening in late October, in the garden by the south wall of the house, with the roses long past their blooming, but the climbing vines still green on the wall, and the lavender dry and fragrant in the autumn air. He had Clara's blessing, which he had asked for privately, man to child, with full seriousness the week before. Clara had looked at him for a moment with those enormous eyes and then said, "Papa, I have been waiting for you to figure this out since April," which was not quite a blessing but was close enough. He did not make a grand speech. He was not a man for grand speeches. He said, "Violet, this land and this house and this family are what I have. They are not small things. They are my whole life. I want you to be part of my whole life if you will have it." He had a ring. It had been his grandmother's, a small, honest ring with a single garnet, which was not fashionable but was real and had a history. Violet looked at the ring in the evening light and then at him, and then at the south wall with the vine still holding on in the autumn, and then back at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I said yes months ago in my own heart, and I have been waiting to say it out loud." He put the ring on her finger. She pressed her other hand over it, holding it in place. "There is something I want to do," she said. "I want to plant something, right here in the garden, something new, not to cover what Ruth planted but beside it. Can we?" "Yes," he said. "What do you want to plant?" She thought about it. "Jasmine," she said. "It grows fast and it is persistent and it smells extraordinary, and I think that is what I want to add here." He smiled. "Jasmine, then." They were married on a Saturday in December of 1879, in the Presbyterian church in Caldwell, with most of the town present because, despite Margaret Tolliver's earlier reservations, Violet Hart had won Caldwell over in 8 months of excellent teaching and honest dealing, and the particular grace she had of making people feel seen. Clara was the flower girl and carried the task out with a seriousness that made half the congregation cry. This child, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's hair, walking up the aisle of the church in her best dress with absolute solemnity, fully conscious of the weight of the moment. Me sat in the front row and wept openly and was not ashamed of it. Phineas stood at the front of the church and watched his daughter walk toward him, and then watched Violet come through the door at the back of the church, in a deep blue dress that she had made herself with the help of the Alvarez sisters from the restaurant. And something in his face did a thing that the people watching described afterward in different ways. Me said he looked like a man coming out of a long winter. Violet's friend from the school board said he looked like a man who had suddenly remembered something he thought he had lost. Clara, asked later what she thought, said, "He looked like Papa but happy," which was perhaps the most accurate description. The ceremony was brief, and the wedding dinner at the Alvarez restaurant was long and full of music, because Manuel Alvarez played the guitar with considerable passion, and his wife Alina had made tamales alongside the traditional wedding supper, and Clara danced with Manuel's youngest son with total earnestness, and everyone agreed it was one of the best nights Caldwell had seen. What came after was the building of a life, which is always quieter and always harder and always more interesting than the story that precedes it. Violet moved from the boarding house to the Hawkins ranch. She brought her 2 traveling bags and her trunk of books and the jar of apple preserves she had not yet opened because she kept meaning to start it, and instead it had become, in her mind, the jar she would open when she arrived at wherever she was truly going. She opened it on her first morning in the ranch kitchen, and me spread it on toast and said, "Not bad," which from me was an extraordinary compliment about preserves. The ranch in winter was a different creature from the ranch in summer. It was quieter and the light was different, and the work was constant and physical in the cold, water lines freezing and cattle needing to be checked, and the house needing more wood than it used in summer. Violet threw herself into all of it with the same energy she applied to everything, learning the rhythms of the place, learning which horses needed what, learning the geography of the land and the names of the neighboring properties and the complicated social map of the county. She also kept teaching. She and Phineas had decided this together, because she loved it and because the school needed her, and because Phineas was not the kind of man who believed a woman's purpose was to stop being herself when she became his wife. She rode to town on school days and home in the afternoons, and on the bad weather days Phineas drove her in the wagon and waited in town until she was done. Clara, in the new arrangement, blossomed in ways that were subtle and then less subtle. She started laughing more often. She went back to drawing with the obsessive energy she had had before Ruth died, and had partly lost in the grief. She began leaving small gifts for Violet in various places around the house, a pretty rock on the windowsill, a drawing of General folded under Violet's teacup, once a flower, somewhat crushed, in the pocket of Violet's coat. Violet received each of these with complete gravity and thanked Clara for them with the same seriousness one applies to receiving important dispatches. One evening in February, Clara climbed into the kitchen chair beside Violet, who was mending one of Phineas's shirts, and said without preamble, "Do you think Mama would have liked you?" Violet set down the mending. She turned and looked at Clara full on. "I hope so," she said. "Everything your father and me have told me about her, I think we might have been friends. She sounds like someone who knew her own mind, and I tend to like people who know their own mind." Clara considered this. "She would have said you were very sensible," she said, which was apparently in Clara's system of values a very high compliment. "I will take that," Violet said. "I think she would be glad you are here," Clara said, with the directness of a child who has decided something and is saying it. "Because of Papa, he is different now, better." Violet looked at her for a moment. "He was always good," she said. "I think he is just less alone now." Clara nodded. This analysis satisfied her. She picked up a piece of the mending and held it in the way of someone who intends to help whether they are asked to or not, and Violet handed her a spool of thread and showed her how to thread the needle, and they sat together in the lamplight while the winter wind moved against the house outside. And this was the kind of moment that does not announce itself as significant but is. In March, Violet discovered she was expecting. She told Phineas on a Thursday evening when he came in from the far pasture, standing in the kitchen with her hands pressed together and her expression somewhere between terrified and luminous. Phineas went very still. Then he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "You are well," he said first, because she was what mattered first. "I am very well," she said. "I am entirely well, and I am very frightened and also so pleased I cannot stand it properly." He kissed her forehead. He held her face. He said, "I have been hoping for this." "Have you?" she said, slightly muffled against his shoulder. "Since November," he admitted. She laughed against his shirt. "You might have mentioned it. It was your body," he said. "I thought you should get there on your own time." "You are a very thoughtful man," she said. "In a number of areas." He held her. The kitchen was warm and me was humming somewhere at the back of the house, and outside the night was cold and clear. He thought about Ruth and held the thought gently, with gratitude, because Ruth had given him Clara and 12 years, and the foundation of everything he knew about loving well. And because loving Violet was not a betrayal of that but an extension of it, the vine continuing to climb the wall. They told Clara at breakfast the next morning. Clara received the news with a long, thoughtful silence, during which both adults experienced moderate anxiety. Then Clara said, "Is it a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Phineas said. "Not for some time." "I would prefer a brother," Clara said. "I can teach him horses. Girls I would have to share a room with." "Both boys and girls require sharing," Violet said. "Brothers can sleep in the barn," Clara said, entirely without malice. "Clara," Phineas said. "Hypothetically," Clara added. They bought a new crib in April, which caused considerable excitement in Caldwell, and various women of the town arrived in the following weeks with hand-sewn blankets and advice about various aspects of pregnancy that Violet accepted with grace and privately evaluated with rigor. Me had opinions about everything and was not hypothetical about any of them. The summer of 1880 was a good one. The cattle prices were decent, and the rains came at the right times, and the jasmine Violet had planted the previous autumn climbed enthusiastically up the south wall alongside the old roses and the climbing vine, which seemed to be accepting its new companion without objection. Clara spent hours in the garden as the weather warmed, cataloging the flowers with the precision of a small scientist and reporting regularly to Violet on the jasmine's progress. "It has reached the second window ledge," she reported in June. "Ahead of schedule," Violet said. "It is very determined," Clara said approvingly. "Like you." Violet looked at her stepdaughter, this serious, bright, remarkable child who had been tending her own grief with such grace. "Thank you," she said. "That is one of the kindest things anyone has said to me." Clara looked slightly embarrassed because at 8 she had developed an awareness of the weight of compliments and changed the subject to the east pasture fence, which needed attention. In late August of 1880, Violet gave birth to a boy. The delivery was difficult in the way that deliveries in 1880 were often difficult. The doctor arriving from town in 3 hours, and me presiding with iron calm through those 3 hours, and Phineas standing outside the bedroom door with Clara asleep against his shoulder, having refused to be put to bed until she knew everyone was all right. The boy was healthy and loud and had Violet's dark hair and Phineas's eyes, and Clara, brought in to see him, stood at the edge of the bed and looked at this new small person with an expression of such complex evaluation that even the doctor paused to watch her. "Hello," Clara said to the baby. "I am your sister. I'm going to teach you horses, but not until you are old enough not to fall off, because falling is unpleasant and horses are not responsible for people who cannot stay seated." The baby looked in the direction of her voice with the unfocused gaze of the newborn. "His name is James," Violet said from the pillow, her voice hoarse and her face exhausted and entirely joyful. "James Hawkins. We thought James." "James," Clara said, trying it. She looked at her father. "That is a good name." Phineas was looking at Violet with everything he felt written plainly across his face, which by now she could read as easily as she read her textbooks. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, and she turned her face into his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, the need to lean being stronger than usual. "Thank you," he said very quietly. "I did most of the work," she pointed out. "You did all of the work," he said. "I just stayed in the corridor feeling helpless." "You were very useful in the months before that," she said, and was rewarded with a laugh that was tired and full and genuine. Me appeared in the doorway. "Supper is ready when anyone is ready," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, which was impressive because her eyes were absolutely not. James Hawkins grew into a loud, cheerful infant who slept badly for the first 4 months and then, as if having decided to give everyone a break, slept beautifully thereafter. Clara did not, in fact, suggest he sleep in the barn, though she did establish early on that the barn was her domain, and that any future visits by James to the barn would be conducted under her supervision and safety regulations. Life on the ranch found its new shape around the new person in it. Violet continued teaching through the autumn of 1880 and returned to it in the spring of 1881, once James was old enough for me to manage during school hours. The Caldwell School Board, which had initially been uncertain about a married teacher, had come to understand that losing Violet Hart would be an educational disaster of the first order, and therefore made no objections. There was one remaining thread that needed resolution, and it came in the spring of 1881, when Violet received a letter from Frances, the Kansas City woman she had written to the previous year. Frances wrote that Gerald Crane had been convicted in Chicago and sentenced to 7 years. She wrote that the process of rebuilding was still incomplete, but that the worst of it was past. She wrote, and this was the part that Violet read twice, "I want you to know that I have thought about the choice you made to write to me after Crane's arrest, when you did not have to, and I believe that tells me what I need to know about who you are. I hope Texas is treating you well. I hope you have found something good." Violet read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning before Phineas was up, with James on her knee making his considered remarks about the world, and she sat for a long time after she finished reading, in the way a person sits when something heavy they have been carrying is being set down. She was not foolish enough to think the setting down was complete, or that the people who had been hurt by Crane's schemes were fully repaired. She was not going to forgive herself entirely, because entire self-forgiveness would require pretending the past had not happened, and she did not want to pretend. But there was something in Frances's letter that was like a hand extended across a long distance, and she took it. Phineas found her at the table half an hour later and read the letter when she passed it to him. He read it carefully, the way he read everything. "You are all right," he said. "Yes," she said. "More than all right, I think." She looked at him. "I think I am done being defined by what I did not do. I will keep remembering it, but I am done letting it tell me who I am." He sat down beside her. "Good," he said, "because who you are is very clear to me and always has been." She took his hand across the table, James watching the operation with great interest from her other arm. "Phineas," she said. "Yes." "I am going to need the garden replanted on the east side," she said. "I have plans." He blinked. "That is where we store the— I know where it is currently," she said. "I am telling you what it is going to become." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "What are you planting?" "Sunflowers," she said, "and marigolds. And I want to try growing tomatoes this year, the large ones, not the small ones. Me says the soil on the east side is better for it." "Me says many things," Phineas said. "Me is correct about most of them," Violet said. "She is," he agreed. "The east side is yours." She smiled at him, the full smile, not the managed one she had arrived in Caldwell wearing, but the real one that she had slowly, over 2 years, allowed him to see. It still knocked the breath out of him every time, and he did not expect this to change. Clara came to the kitchen at 7 in the morning in her riding clothes, already finished with being a child sleeping at reasonable hours, and looked at her parents at the table and James on Violet's knee and said, "Is there coffee?" Because she was 8 3/4, and in her view this made coffee a legitimate consideration. "No," Phineas said. "Papa," she said. "Hot milk," me said from behind her, arriving in the kitchen as if she had been summoned. "And there are biscuits." Clara sat down. She looked at the letter on the table. "Good news?" she asked, because she had her father's ability to read a room. "Yes," Violet said. "Very good news." "Good," Clara said. "Because General got out of the paddock again and I need help catching him, and I thought good spirits might make everyone more cooperative about it." "Which direction?" Phineas said, already standing. "East," Clara said. "He saw the squash coming up in the kitchen garden, and I believe his intent was malicious." "His intent was squash," Phineas said. "Get your boots." What followed was 45 minutes of a man, a girl, and a horse engaging in a negotiation that the horse won on points but lost on ground, ending with General back in the paddock and everyone muddy. Violet watched from the fence with James on her hip, and the laughter she felt looking at her husband and her stepdaughter covered in mud arguing with a horse was so full and so uncomplicated that it seemed like a different thing from any happiness she had known before, something broader and more rooted. She had come to Caldwell carrying the weight of betrayal and hidden guilt, and the dark past of a woman whose trust had been weaponized by someone who should not have had it. She had come looking for a place where the story could be rewritten. She had not expected to find, within 8 months of arriving, the fundamental rewriting taking the form of a man in a ranch gate, watching her ride away with something undeniable in his face. She had not expected Clara. That was perhaps the thing she was most grateful for, the one she had not planned and could not have predicted. Clara with her serious eyes and her hoarse opinions and her small gifts left in coat pockets. Clara, who had looked at her on the second visit and said, matter-of-factly, "You are very good at listening," as if this were a credential she had verified. Clara, who had sat beside her father in the church on their wedding day and held his hand during the ceremony without anyone asking her to. It was Clara who had said, that warm evening in late summer, the words that had broken Phineas open and sent him out the back door of his own kitchen. It had been one of those ordinary evenings made extraordinary by small accumulation, the kind you only recognize as significant in retrospect. Violet had been making supper, moving around the kitchen with the comfort of someone who had been doing this in this space for months, knowing where everything was, knowing how me preferred the flour stored, and how Phineas liked his coffee, and how Clara took her milk in the evenings. Clara had come in from outside smelling of the garden, having spent an hour examining the jasmine's progress with the obsessive thoroughness of a scientist, and she had come directly to Violet and stood close to her the way she did sometimes, seeking proximity without asking for it outright. And she had put her face against Violet's arm, and then she had stepped back, and she had looked at her father in the doorway, and she had said it simply and without drama, the way a child says the truest things. "She smells like Mama's garden." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Phineas had been holding a cup. He set it down. He did not say anything. He could not say anything because the words had taken the breath from him in a way that nothing had in 2 years. Clara looked up at Violet with those enormous eyes and said, "Is that all right to say?" Because she was 8 and she had been navigating the complex country between past and present, and she always checked her maps. Violet crouched down to Clara's level and said, "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." Clara nodded. "Jasmine and rose water," she said. "Mama grew both." She paused. "I think she would say it was a good choice." And Phineas walked out the back door. He walked onto the back porch and he braced his hands against the railing and he looked out over the ranch that Ruth had loved and that was still living, still breathing, still producing things. The roses still blooming every summer, the lavender still coming back, and now the jasmine climbing. He stood there and he breathed, and what he felt was not betrayal and it was not grief alone, though grief was in it. What he felt was the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and suddenly discovers that other hands have come to help carry it, not to take it away, not to pretend it was never there, but to help carry it. He heard the back door open behind him. He did not turn around. He heard Violet's footsteps cross the porch and then she was beside him, her arms leaning on the railing the same as his, looking out at the same view. They were quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not trying to replace her." "I know," he said. "That is not what this is." "What is it then?" she said, not asking it in an uncertain way but in the way of someone who wants to hear what he has found. He turned to look at her in the early evening light. "It is the garden keeping on growing," he said. "It is the things we plant being bigger than the planting." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "It is Clara," he said, knowing enough to see what is good and being brave enough to say it. Violet pressed her lips together for a moment. "She is remarkable," she said. "She has good judgment," he said. "She chose you months before I had the sense to get there." "She is a menace," Violet said with enormous affection. "She is," Phineas said. "She gets it from both sides now." He reached out and put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood together on the back porch of the Hawkins ranch in the late summer of 1881, looking out over the land that had been built with stubbornness and love through drought and grief, and the kind of starting over that requires everything you have. The sun went down. The stars came on one by one the way they did out here, where there was enough dark to see them properly. The cicadas were very loud. James, from somewhere inside, made a sound that was the precursor to wanting supper, and Clara's voice was heard addressing him with calm authority. "I will handle it," Phineas said. "We both will," Violet said. They went inside together. The years that followed built themselves the way good years do, through dailiness and decision, and the accumulated weight of small moments that only become visible as a whole when you stand back far enough to see them. James learned to walk in the spring of 1882 and applied this new skill immediately to the south garden, where he sat in the dirt among the roses and the jasmine with total contentment, pulling at things with determined 2-year-old hands while Clara supervised and me watched from the kitchen window. Clara turned 9 and then 10, and at 10 her horsemanship was being discussed across 3 counties as something exceptional, and Phineas had begun to understand that his daughter's future was likely to involve horses in some professional capacity, and was adjusting his expectations accordingly. Violet planted the east garden with sunflowers and marigolds and the large tomatoes, and me was impressed enough to say so plainly, which was her highest possible form of botanical endorsement. She also planted a new section with herbs, rosemary and thyme and sage, because a kitchen garden was a thing she had always wanted and had never had, and because there was satisfaction in growing things that could be used. She wrote to her mother in Kansas City, with whom she had had a complicated and somewhat distant relationship since the Crane affair. The letters were careful at first, and then gradually less careful as her mother's responses became warmer, something about distance and time, and the evident happiness in Violet's letters doing the work that direct conversation had failed to do. By the summer of 1882, her mother had sent a parcel of seeds, varieties she grew in Kansas City that Violet had known from childhood, and the inclusion of those seeds in the package was its own vocabulary. In 1883, Violet discovered she was expecting again, which she told Phineas on a Thursday evening with considerably less terror and considerably more joy than the first time. James, told he was getting a sibling, said "oh" and returned to his truck, which was his primary interest at age 2 3/4. Clara was cautiously optimistic and did not repeat her suggestion about the barn, having apparently retired that position. The second child, born in the autumn of 1883, was a girl. They named her Ruth because Phineas had asked Violet if she would mind, and Violet had taken his hand and said, "I would love nothing more," and meant it completely. There was no competition in it and no forced choice. It was simply the right name for a child who had arrived in a house where Ruth's roses still bloomed every summer. Baby Ruth had Phineas's dark eyes and Violet's dark hair, and a personality that declared itself at approximately 2 weeks old as entirely her own, which everyone found both exhausting and delightful. Clara, at nearly 12, had appointed herself the baby's senior advisor, and took this role with the same seriousness she applied to everything. James, approaching 4, regarded his new sister with the measured assessment of a person, evaluating whether this development was going to be good for him on balance, and largely concluded that it was, because it meant more people to have opinions to him, which he valued. The ranch in the mid-1880s was a different thing from the ranch Phineas had nearly sold in the dark months after Ruth's death. It was a living, argued-over, cared-for place, full of voices and animals and the particular organized chaos of a family that had come together through grief and hope and the willingness to keep planting things. The south garden was magnificent. The jasmine had climbed to the top of the south wall and was working its way along the eaves, which me said was going to be a structural problem, and Phineas said was extraordinary, and Violet said was exactly what jasmine did when you gave it room. The roses that Ruth had planted in the first year of the marriage were now 14 years old and vast, spilling over the fence and blooming every summer in a color that was almost unreal. The lavender had seeded itself into the cracks between the stones, which was lavender's particular way of announcing that it intended to stay. Clara, at 15, could break a horse in 3 days that would take other handlers 2 weeks. Word had gotten around, as it does in the flatlands, and ranchers from neighboring properties had begun asking, respectfully, whether Clara Hawkins might have time to look at a particular difficult animal. Phineas was proud in a way that was past language. He watched his daughter with a horse and thought of Ruth, who had also known exactly what she was good at and had done it without apology. James at 7 was cheerful and physical and opinionated, which was genetically inevitable given the material he was working with, and he had decided at 6 that horses were fine, but cattle were his real interest, which gave Clara something to tease him about for years. Ruth the younger, at 4, was a person of enormous presence who had already developed the habit of walking into a room and immediately locating whoever most needed her attention, which Violet recognized as something she had been told she herself did, and which made her look at this small daughter with particular tenderness. One evening in the summer of 1887, Phineas and Violet sat on the back porch the way they did in evenings when the children were in bed and me had retired and the ranch was quiet, which was perhaps their favorite time, the time when the day was done and the land was still, and they could hear themselves think. They had been doing this for 8 years by now, sitting on this porch in this particular hour, and it was still, every time, the best part of Phineas's day. He was 42, and the lines in his face were deeper and his hair had gone partially silver at the temples, which Violet found unreasonably distinguished and had told him so, which had embarrassed him and pleased him in equal measure. She was 34, and the severe pinning of her Kansas City days had given way entirely to something more comfortable, her hair often only partially up by evening, and she had a kind of ease in her face now that had not been there at the beginning, the ease of someone who has stopped bracing for what might be coming and decided to inhabit the present tense. "I want to tell you something," Phineas said. "Tell me," she said. "I want to tell you that I think of Ruth every day," he said. "I want you to know that, and I want you to know it is true, and I also want you to know that thinking of her does not diminish this." He gestured, not at anything specific, at everything. "I used to think those things were in conflict. I do not think that now." Violet looked at him. "I know," she said. "You have never needed to hide that from me." "I know that too," he said. "I am saying it anyway because it matters to say it." She reached over and took his hand. He held hers. "I want to tell you something too," she said. "Tell me." "I want to tell you that I came to Caldwell with almost nothing that was still intact," she said. "I was trying to be whole again, and I was not sure it was possible. And what I found here was not what I was looking for, because what I was looking for was just a quiet place to put the pieces back together alone." She paused. "What I found was entirely better than what I was looking for. I was not looking for you either," he said. "No, you were buying grain, and a bridle, and sending a letter, all of which I did eventually," he said. "You did," she said, "a man of your word." The cicadas were very loud and the stars were very bright, and the ranch land spread out in the dark ahead of them, alive with the small sounds of a summer night, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the garden on the south wall was growing, always growing, in the way that things do when they are planted by hands that know what they are doing and given enough water and enough stubbornness and enough love. In 1889, Caldwell had grown enough that the school required 2 teachers, and Violet helped hire her own assistant, a young woman named Josephine from San Antonio who arrived with excellent credentials and a slight unease about Caldwell's size, which Violet told her would pass. She was right. It passed in 3 weeks. Clara married a rancher named Thomas Braddock when she was 22. A quiet, steady man from 3 counties over who had come to her for help with a horse, and had found in the process that she was the most direct and interesting person he had ever met. Phineas spent 4 months sizing Thomas up before declaring him acceptable, which Clara said was the longest 4 months of her life, and Violet said was entirely in character, and me said was reasonable given the circumstances. James at 14 was taller than his father and still cattle-obsessed, and had become the ranch's most reliable hand in the way of second-generation ranchers who have absorbed the knowledge through simple proximity. Ruth the younger at 10 had decided she was going to be a teacher like her mother, which she announced at the supper table with the finality of someone delivering a policy statement. And everyone accepted it because she delivered it with such certainty that disagreement seemed beside the point. Violet, at 41, was still teaching at Caldwell School, and had in the years of her tenure built it into one of the better-regarded schools in that part of Texas, with a library of 300 books and a curriculum that included both the practical and the aspirational and the kind of history that did not omit the difficult parts. She had also, over the years, written several times to Francis in Kansas City, and Francis had written back, and there was in those letters a real and unlikely friendship that had grown from the ashes of something terrible into something that had its own worth. Gerald Crane had served his 7 years and had, by all accounts, gone to ground somewhere, and Violet did not track him and did not need to. The past was not something she had forgotten. It was something she had set down, like a heavy thing, not thrown away but put in its proper place where it could not hurt anyone by being carried wrong. Phineas at 46 was still the most careful man she had ever known, still careful with the land and with his children and with her, still bringing her coffee in the morning before anything else, still standing at the gate when she came home in the evenings with the horses, still finding, apparently, everything she did of interest. This had not worn down in 14 years. She did not expect it to wear down. They celebrated their 14th anniversary quietly, as they celebrated most of their anniversaries, with a supper that me made special and a walk in the evening, and a long time sitting on the back porch looking at the garden in the summer dark, the jasmine and the roses and the lavender, and the sunflowers and the marigolds and the rosemary and the thyme and all the growing things they had put in the ground together, and tended through drought and cold, and the Texas summers that were sometimes merciless. The South Garden was famous in Caldwell by now, or famous enough that people sometimes drove past the ranch road to look at it. Me had been heard to say that it was the finest garden in the county, which me did not say lightly, and which Violet privately agreed with, not from pride but from the particular satisfaction of having tended something with full attention and watched it become. It needs expanding, Violet said on this anniversary evening. The garden, Phineas said. The whole south side, she said. I want to take the fence back another 6 feet and put in a proper perennial border. Something that will still be here in 30 years. He looked at her. You are already planning 30 years ahead. I always plan 30 years ahead, she said. That is why you married me. I married you, he said, because you were standing outside the mercantile with an armful of books and you made a dry remark about falling into people and I had not laughed in longer than I could remember. She turned to look at him. That is what did it. That, he said, and Ruth grew roses which you received in exactly the right way. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The garden was fragrant in the summer night, the jasmine particularly, sending its particular sweetness out over the dark, persistent and generous. Clara's voice carried from the window of the main house, talking to someone, probably Thomas in the guest room where they were staying for the week. James was long since asleep, as was Ruth the younger, who slept like a person who had arranged the world to her satisfaction. Me's light was still on at the back of the house because Me stayed up late reading, which she had always done and which Phineas had stopped commenting on years ago. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything was in its right place. Phineas, Violet said. Yes. I want you to know something. Tell me. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the dark. The first evening I came here for supper, she said, and I rode away afterward. I spent the whole 8 miles home thinking about how I was going to be sensible about this. I made very thorough arguments to myself about it. I remember the evening, he said. What I did not realize, she said, was that it was already decided. It had been decided since the sidewalk. I was just arguing with something that was already done. He looked at her. The stars were enormous above them. the old stars that the Greeks had named and that Clara had learned and that James now knew and that young Ruth was in the process of learning, generation by generation, inheriting the names of things. "It was already decided for me too," he said. "I just took a little longer to stop arguing." She smiled at him. He smiled back. 14 years, and he still found himself affected by that smile, the real one, the one she had arrived in town trying not to show, the one that was the whole uncomplicated truth of her. He kissed her. She kissed him back. There on the back porch of the Hawkins ranch, with the garden around them and the night above them and the children in the house behind them and the land stretching out ahead. The land that had been here before any of them and would be here after, but that held in its soil and along its fences and in the roots of its climbing things, the particular shape of what this family had made. The jasmine was in full bloom. The roses were in their second week of it, the deep red ones Ruth had planted in their first year, and the newer ones Violet had added. The lavender had gone purple-silver and would be dried for the kitchen in another week. The sunflowers were 6 feet high on the east side. The garden smelled, as it always smelled in summer, like something living and insistent, and full of what it was. A smell that Clara had once described with perfect accuracy as her mother's garden and her stepmother's garden and everyone's garden, because it had been added to by every set of hands that had loved it, and what was planted in love grew exactly like that, full and fragrant and absolutely refusing to stop. The night settled around the Hawkins ranch like a familiar thing, like something that had been waiting to settle. The lights went on inside as the family prepared for sleep. Phineas and Violet sat a little longer on the porch, as they always did, in no hurry, because there was no hurry left. Everything had been arrived at. Everything had been found. The story that had started on a sidewalk with a collision and a dry remark, and a man saying Ruth grew roses in a voice like he was setting something precious gently down, that story had grown into this. This porch, these people, this garden, this life. All things considered, it was exactly what it was supposed to be.